Hello guys, welcome back to the channel YouTube Demystified, and let us continue with our BA Honors Philosophy Sem 3 course. We were in the previous videos we had discussed about the problem that is faced by the political philosophy nowadays and how it has almost come to an end, and what are the difficulties that to take up a scientific approach towards the subject. Now in the modern science, value judgments are not considered, which, according to Leo Strauss, is not appropriate. That no matter how much we try, value judgments are included either directly or indirectly. And secondly, value judgments make a judgment better, they are necessary. Now, we'll look at the classical solution, the second part of this. So, when we describe the political philosophy of Plato and of Aristotle as classical political philosophy, we imply that it is the classic form of political philosophy. So, you must know this, that Plato and Aristotle were the two philosophers who started with political philosophy in Athens that long time ago. So, the political philosophy that was started by them is known as the classical philosophy. Now, the classic was once said to be characterized by noble simplicity and quiet grandeur. So here Leo Strauss is emphasizing the importance and the how classical political philosophy was so much better. So he uses the words like quiet grandeur and simplicity, noble simplicity. This suggestion guides us in the right direction. It is an attempt to articulate what was formerly called as the natural character of classical thought. So throughout the text, he tries to tell us how the political philosophy, the classical political philosophy, was very much natural and instinctual in its approach. Natural is here understood in contra distinction to what is merely human, all to human. A man is said to be natural if he is guided by nature rather than by convention or by inherited opinion or by tradition, or to say nothing of mere whims. So when the classical political philosophy is regarded as natural, what is meant here is that, as I use the word instinctual, that the man, the classical political philosophy was driven by instincts rather than by tradition or by the inherited opinion. That means whatever the ancestors thought. What happens today is, in society, we almost follow the rules and regulations, and we work according to what the ancestors have left us. That is what the popular thought, or the common thought today is, the driving thought of the society is. But the classical political philosophy was natural in its approach, because first of all, it was of course the first of it. So there was no established or well recognized political philosophical thought as such. So whatever was started by Plato and Aristotle were very much natural, were very much what came to the instinctual mind. Classical political philosophy is non traditional, but it belongs to the fertile moment when all political traditions were shaken and there was not yet in existence a tradition of political philosophy. So, as I've told you, that there was no existing tradition of political philosophy back then, and that is why when it was started in the very natural form. Now, later on, all the political philosophy that was later on developed, which again had the backdrop of classical political philosophy. So somewhere or the other, the later political philosophy had to follow the tradition of malab, somewhere or the other, either they would agree with the classical thought or they would disagree with the classical thought. Somewhere their base was found in the classical political philosophy only. In all later epochs, the philosopher's study of political things was meditated by a tradition of political philosophy which acted like a screen between the philosopher and political thing, regardless of whether the individual philosopher cherished or rejected that tradition. So, of course, the already established classical political philosophy acted as a screen between the philosopher and the political things. So, what happens is, we may think that okay, today you have a new idea or you have a new theory of any subject of any kind. Now we may think that it is something our own creation, but what actually happens is that it was somewhere or the other inspired by our surroundings or by the existing thoughts in play. So we don't realize it, but our thoughts and ideas today are inspired by the previous ones or what is already present. From this, it follows that the classical philosophers saw the political things with a freshness and directedness which has never been equaled. So, of course, when somebody starts an entirely new thing, that is very fresh in its approach because nothing like that has existed ever before. So it is their very natural, very first thought. Now, later on, whatever development happens in that field, that is always the backdrop of that first, development, the first thought. So it is no longer natural but always traditional then in its approach. There is no other reason for this than the fact that they look further afield in the same direction as the enlightened citizens or the statesmen. So they, when talked about philosophers, they always look in the further back direction. Matlab, even the statesmen, the enlightened citizens, the point till where they can look. The philosophers has the ability to look even farther beyond it. They do not look at political things from the outside as spectators of political life. They speak the language of the citizens or statesmen. They hardly use a single term which is not familiar to the marketplace. Hence, their political philosophy is comprehensive. It is both political theory and political skill. It is as receptive to the legal and institutional aspects of political life as it is to which transcends the legal and institutional. It is equally free from the narrowness of the lawyer, the brutality of the technician, the vagaries of the visionary, and the baseness of the opportunist. So the political philosophers, they don't look at political philosophy as, from somewhere from the outside, like, they don't know anything. Matlab, they very much look at political philosophy as they're a part of that thing. They're part of the society from the very inside, from the very core. And that is why their vision or their point of view or looking at political philosophy is very much different than the others who's who look at it from a outer perspective. Okay, for it's a very common example today. If we study the civilization or the society of any other country, say America or Britain or any other thing, we will always look at it from the perspective of an outsider, not from the one that is already present or that has already experienced it. So it makes a lot, it makes so much difference that we cannot imagine. Looking at something from an outer perspective, from being an outsider, it makes a lot of difference. And what the political philosophers matlab, have and don't have is that they use the term of the statesmen only. Matlab, that they don't they don't go on inventing new terms and doing new things and nothing like that. They are already looking at things the way that they exist, and they are then using them in their political philosophy. They speak the language of a common statesman. They don't speak a high profile language which is something out of the context, or they don't go on creating new words with on different meanings. So, and also, as they have compared here, that they are free from the narrowness of the lawyer. That means a lawyer is always bound by the law. A lawyer will always see things in perspective of the law, and his or her hands will always be bound by the law. So narrowness of the lawyer, the brutality of a technician, the vagaries of a visionary, because a visionary will go on thinking anything. For a visionary, even a utopian vision or a utopian thing is possible. So a visionary, the name itself suggests that it's imaginative. And even the baseness of the opportunist. So the political philosopher is free from all of these what we say demerits, or the the things that should not be included. It reproduces and raises to its perfection the magnanimous flexibility of the true statesman who crushes the insolent and spares the vanquished. It is free from all fanaticism because it knows that evil cannot be eradicated, and therefore that one's expectation from politics can be moderate. The spirit which animates it may be described as serenity or sublime sobriety. So, of course, here he is describing what is the state of mind of a political philosopher. That how it is how the political philosophers realize the ground situation, that it's not possible for politics to be free of all the evil. So what he's trying to say is that the thought or the views of a political philosophers are very much practical, which can be practiced in everyday life. Compared with classical political philosophy or later political thought, whatever else its merits may be, and in particular, modern political thought has a derivative character. They have a derivative character because they have been derived from the classical political philosophy. They have been derived from the already existing, the first classical philosophy. So it was always have a derivative character. It will always have something or the other borrowed from the classical political philosophy. This means that in later times there has occurred an estrangement from the simple and primary issues. So when the classical political philosophy first started, it focused on the very primary issues, on the very simple issues. But later on, it shifted to the secondary, the tertiary issues, or even not the primary, but a lot more detailed. This has given to political philosophy the character of abstractness, and has therefore engendered the view that the philosophic movement must be a movement not from opinion to knowledge, not from here and now to what is always and eternal, but from the abstract toward the concrete. So this, because of this derivative character and because of not focusing on the very simplest and very primary of issues, today political philosophy and even philosophy has derived a character of abstractness. We see that today, when we talk about politics or political things or political terms, political theory, we always refer to as justice and freedom, and how there are so many different things, and there is political justice, economic justice, and when we go on deep studying about them, we realize that justice is basically like an utopian vision, like a utopian thing, that it's not really possible for everyone to be in a just position by one law or one thing, because somewhere or the other anybody would be, would not have the freedom of doing something, or freedom and justice and all of these political things, somewhere or the other they're not entirely possible. So this is the reason that today political philosophy and philosophy has had a is known for an abstract character where nothing is concrete. And today political philosophy, which was earlier known from going from opinion to knowledge, today we only talk about getting something concrete, getting something very very factual, and not something very baseless or very abstract. So this is one of the reasons, but this is one of the things that has that philosophy and political philosophy has gained today. It was thought that by virtue of this movement toward the concrete, recent philosophy had overcome the limitations not only of modern political philosophy but of classical political philosophy as well. It was overlooked, however, that this change of orientation perpetuated the original defect of modern philosophy because it accepted abstraction at its starting point, and that the concrete at which one eventually arrived was not at all the truly concrete but still an abstraction. So, what has happened is that this modern philosophy, it started with a point of abstraction and it still went on to the point of abstraction, because what was thought as being concrete was not actually concrete, was not actually what it is meant to be. One example must suffice here. Today, it is held in certain circles that the basic task of political or social science is to understand the most concrete human relationship, and that relationship is called I, thou, we. Okay, I, you, we. Thou is, of course, I, you, we relation. It is one of the most concrete human relationships of I, you, and then we together. So it is obvious that the thou and the we are supplements to Descartes' ego. The question is whether the fundamental inadequacy of Descartes' ego can be disposed of. The question is whether the fundamental inadequacy of Descartes' ego can be disposed of by any supplements, and whether it is not necessary to return to a more fundamental beginning or to the natural beginning. So today, one of the most concrete, this is something that we have been hearing for quite a long time now. I, you, we. We is the relationship that all of us now talk about. That it is it's not it matlab, it's I, then you, matlab, it should be the we, that should be the end of everything. The phenomena, which is now called the either we relationship, is known to the classics by the name of friendship. So, here what he's trying to say is that today, friendship, which was very natural, which was supposed to be a very free kind of thing, which has developed naturally between two people, is now something of a contract or something, that we are naming it, we are labeling it into something, and we are somewhere forcing it, or we are forging something where we're trying to create it. Whereas in earlier times, this I though we relationship was very naturally and unknowingly developed by people. When speaking to a friend, I address him in the second person, but philosophical, scientific analysis, not speaking to a friend, that is to the individual here and now, but speaking to anyone concerned with such analysis. So now today, like modern philosophy, as we have said, it starts with abstractness and all. So according to the scientific or the philosophic approach, we're not really talking to a friend, but it's a very very different and contracted relationship. Such analysis cannot be meant to be a substitute for living together as friend. It can be at best only point to such living together or arouse a desire for it. So when speaking about someone with whom I have a close relationship, I call him my friend. I do not call him thou. Okay, so adequately speaking about an analytical or objective speech must be grounded in and continue the manner of speaking about which is inherent in human life. So, when speaking about such analysis cannot be meant to be a substitute for living together as friends. It can be at best only point to such living together or arouse a desire for it. So, when speaking about someone with whom I have a close relationship, I call him my friend. I do not call him thou. Adequately speaking about in analytical or objective speech must be grounded in and continue the manner of speaking about which is inherent in human life. So by speaking of the thou instead of the friend, I am trying to preserve in objective speech what cannot be preserved in objective speech. So we are talking about the you. So instead of referring to him or her as your friend, you say the you, because I, you, we. So this is a new relationship which changes the mental character of a person. I am trying to objectify something which is incapable of being objectified, because friendship is something which is very, very subjective. There are different kinds of friends. You have different level of friendship with different friends. The two friends, you cannot say Malab, you have different friends. Of course, two people, you are one person, but you have different types of friends all around. But when you say that instead of friend, when you say you, so you are totally objectifying that relationship. You are labeling many such friends as only you. So you are trying to objectify it and not, you're not trying to objectify the subjective. And that subjective is your friendship. I'm trying to preserve in speaking about what can be actual only in speaking to. That is, I do injustice to the phenomena. I am untrue to the phenomena. I miss the concrete while attempting to lay a foundation for genuine human communication. I preserve an incapacity for it. So, the character of classical political philosophy appears with the greatest clarity from Plato's Law, which is his political work par excellence. So, now when we talk about the classical political philosophy, we know a great deal about the classical political philosophy from the work Laws, which is of course by Plato. So, the laws is a conversation about law and political things in general between an old Athenian stranger, an old Cretan, and an old Spartan. So now, this is something that we'll read ahead, of course, here only, that Sparta was a place where the law of the ancestors was being followed, and how the Athenian has come there to went there to convince them, to show them what the actual law and how should it be. And let's discuss it and you'll know it. See, the conversation takes place on the island of Crete. At the beginning, one receives the impression that the Athenian has come to Crete in order to study their best laws. Now, Crete and Sparta are the places where the laws of the ancestors were followed. That means whatever the ancestors have laid down before, that was strictly followed. That means it was a very traditional place where the traditions were strictly adhered to. So, earlier there was the impression that the Athenian, where there was a wave of new and modern laws and this and that, an Athenian has come to Crete and Sparta to study their traditional laws and to learn from the best of the laws. And this Athenian we are very familiar with, that you'll come to know. We're very familiar with this Athenian. Okay. So at the beginning, one receives the for if it is true that the good is identical with the ancestral, but the best laws for a Greek would be the oldest Greek laws, and these are the Cretan laws. So there was this saying that the good is identical with the ancestral, the best is the oldest. Okay, so whatever the oldest, it is the best. So, of course, the Cretan laws and the Spartan laws were the oldest, one of the oldest laws of Greek, because it were formed by the ancestors long before, and they were still followed and still adhered to. Hence, the Cretans believed that, but the equation of the good with the ancestor is not tenable if the first ancestors were not gods, or sons of gods, or pupils of gods. So, the ancestors, okay, they have to be either the sons of God or the pupils of God. That means they have to have a direct connection with the God somehow. Only then the laws that were made by the ancestors were good. So hence the Cretans believed that their laws were originated by Zeus, who instructed his son Minos, the Cretan legislator. So what the Cretans believed is, if you're understanding the scenario, the Cretans followed the laws of their ancestors, which their ancestors have made long ago. Okay, and why they thought it to be good was because they thought that their ancestors, like Minos, okay, was Zeus's son. Zeus is a Greek god, and Zeus was the one who instructed Minos. And Minos was the Cretan legislator who made the laws. That means they are equating that the ancestors who made the laws were somewhere directly in relation with the god, and that is why the laws that were given to the Cretans by their ancestors were the best of laws. The laws opens with an expression of this belief. It appears immediately afterward that this belief has no other ground, no better ground than a saying of Homer, and the poets are of questionable veracity, as well as what the Cretans say, and the Cretans were famous for their lack of veracity. However, this may be very shortly after its beginning the conversation shift from the question of the origins of the Cretans' law and Spartan laws to the question of their intrinsic worth. Now, it was the Cretans and the Spartans were under the impression that the Athenian has come to learn about the best of their laws. But what actually turns out is that the Athenian was actually questioning them, doubting them, and was trying to prove them. Now, this is something very common method of a very famous Athenian, which we all know. Of course, Socrates, the Elenchus method. Okay, the questioning method of Socrates. So the Athenian is none other than Socrates, and he had not actually come to learn from the laws, but actually he was there to prove that this concrete belief that you carry with yourself, that the ancestors laws are the best laws, it's not actually correct. He starts to question that, okay, what is the intrinsic worth? Intrinsic, we know, something which is inner, which is carried within itself. So what is the actual worth that the laws carries with themselves over the generations? A code given by a god Moi, a being of the superhuman excellence, must be unqualifiedly good. Qualifiedly good. Very slowly, very circumspectly, does the Athenian approach this grave question. To begin with, he limits his criticism of the principle underlying that the Cretan and the Spartan codes by criticizing not these codes, but a poet, a man without authority, and in addition an expatriate who had praised the same principle. So, how the Athenian or Socrates starts with his approach is, of course, the laws, the Spartan, well, the laws were very dear to the Spartans and Cretans, and at that time in the history, if you read about Spartia and Crete and all of these places, you'll read that the people were very proud that they would follow their ancestors, and they were walking on the path of what the ancestors has instructed them to. So they were very proud of the fact. And Socrates was well aware that if he had directly criticized the laws themselves, that how the law today is not in accordance with the present and reality, the Spartans and Cretans would have just killed him, or would have been very much like, wouldn't have heard him anymore. So how he starts is that instead of criticizing the law himself, the law itself, he starts criticizing any one poet or a person who has praised the same principle. Okay, so he first starts that there is a fault in the person itself, that the person who has praised the principle, there is a fault in that person. So that way he would then go on proving that then if the person was wrong, the choice of the person would also be wrong. In the sequel, the philosopher attacks not yet the Cretan and Spartan codes, but the interpretation of these. Okay, so now what happens is, in the next step, now he moves a little further, and then again he's not directly criticizing the law or the principles, but what he's doing is he's criticizing the interpretation of these, that how they have been interpreted by the present generation is wrong. That is not the correct way. So he does not begin to criticize these venerable codes explicitly until he has appealed to a presumed Cretan and Spartan law which permits such criticism under certain conditions, conditions which are fulfilled to some extent in the present conversation. So the third step that he goes to is, then he proves that in the laws or in the codes itself it is given that the codes can be criticized under certain conditions, and then that Athenian or Socrates goes on proving that okay, today that the conditions that we are actually in, those permit the criticization of those codes, and that is why we can criticize the codes. So very smartly, step by step, he goes on criticizing them. He is moving closer to criticizing those laws. He's not directly doing it. According to that law, all must say with one voice and with one mouth that all the laws of Crete or of Sparta are good because they are God given, and no one is suffered to say something different. But an old citizen may utter a criticism of an allegedly divine law before a magistrate of his own age if no young men are present. So now he goes on saying that there is one such law that nobody has can say that the laws are bad, or this every divine and God given law are good. But an old man can say or criticize the law only in front of the person of the same age, the old man only, not in front of the young man. Because what will happen is, if that old man criticizes the law in front of the young man, the young will try to change it, the newer generation will try to change it and bring about a change in it. So the old man can only criticize the law in front of the other old man or the person of the same age only. By this time, it has become clear to the reader that the Athenian has not come to Crete in order to study their best laws, but rather to introduce into Crete new laws and institutions, truly good laws and institutions. These laws and institutions will prove to be a considerable extent of Athenian origin. It seems that the Athenian, being the son of a highly civilized society, has embarked on the venture of civilizing a rather uncivilized society. So now we are seeing that how much the Cretans and Spartans, who were very very proud of they following their ancestors' steps, and how they were very well organized and civilized and the law following people, now they're referred to as the uncivilized people, and the Athenian was the one who was there to teach them. Therefore he has to apprehend that this suggestion will be odious not only as innovations but above all as foreign, as Athenian. Deep-seated old animosities and suspicions will be aroused by his recommendations. Now there's another problem, is that these laws would be Athenians. The new laws that would be introduced will be Athenians and not of their own origin. So of course they would be foreign in their descent. And if the laws become successful, when the laws become successful, all the credit will go to Athenians, and the Cretans and Spartans will have to have a very small face then, that their laws were not really good, but the Athenian laws, the foreign laws, were actually better. Therefore, he has to apprehend his suggestion. Okay, he begins his explicit criticism with a remark about the probable connection between certain Cretan and Spartan institutions and the practice of homosexuality in these cities. The Spartan, rising in defense of his fatherland, does not indeed defend homosexuality, but turning to the offensive, rebukes the Athenians for their excessive drinking. Now, the Spartan, somewhere, of course, the Spartan and the Cretan will try to protect their fatherland. That time, the land, or the birth of the place of their birth, was not referred to as the motherland but the fatherland. So that how the Athenians would drink so much and always be in a state of unconsciousness because of the drinking and this and that. So the Athenian is thus given a perfect excuse for recommending the introduction of the Athenian institution of banquets. He is compelled to defend that institution, and by defending it, he acts the part not of a civilizing philosopher, who, being a philosopher, is a philanthropist, but of the patriot. So he acts in a way which is perfectly understandable to his interlocutors and perfectly respectable in their opinion. He acts in a way which is perfectly understandable to his interlocutors and perfectly respectable in their opinion. He attempts to show that wine drinking and even drunkenness, if it is practiced in banquets well presided over, is conducive to education, intemperance, or moderation. So, what the Athenian is trying to tell them is that okay, maybe drinking, but if drinking is done in a very moderate and controlled manner, like in banquets, and it is presided over, that means if it is looked upon, that is not going to excessive drinkingness, even then matlab in that conditions drinking can produce education, can really give education of moderation, and education as such that everybody benefits from it. The speech about wine forms the bulk of the first two books of the laws. Only after the speech about wine has been brought to his conclusion does the Athenian turn to the question of the beginning of political life. So, to a question which is the true beginning of his political theme, the speech about the wine appears to be the introduction to political philosophy. So all these talks about wine, that how even after drinking the person goes into a state of moderation and not of extreme, and this and that is the first part, and it is like an introduction to political philosophy, that how political philosophy should not include extremities but moderation. Why does the Platonic dialogue about politics and laws begin with such an extensive conversation about wine? What is the artistic or logographic necessity demanding this? The proper interlocutors in a conversation about laws are old citizens of communities famous for their laws, for their obedience and allegiance to their old laws. Okay, so the old citizens who have very diligently followed their laws and they were very obedient, they are the proper interlocutors in a conversation about laws. Okay, because these old citizens have very diligently followed all the laws, they have walked very very precisely over the laws. They are the perfect incarnation of the spirit of the laws, of lawfulness, of law abidingness. So very simply, that the old citizens are like the spirit of lawfulness, because it is them who have kept the spirit of the laws alive. However, their very virtue becomes a defect if there is no longer a question of preserving old laws, but of seeking the best laws, of introducing better ones. But this very virtue, this very quality of the old citizens, that how very diligently they have protected the law and they have carried the spirit of lawfulness, it becomes futile and worthless if there is a need to introduce new laws. So it just proves that the old citizens and the spirit of lawfulness that they have preserved for so long, which was actually wrong. However, their very virtue becomes a defect if there is no longer a question of preserving old laws. So, their habits and their competence make these men impervious to suggestions for improvement. The Athenian induces them to participate in a conversation about wine drinking, about a pleasure that is forbidden to them by their old laws. Now, the Athenian starts by criticizing the laws by the wine drinking. They say that okay, in your old laws wine drinking has been prohibited, that you should not be drinking wine. But now the Athenian tries to prove to him that why wine drinking should not be forbidden in the law, and that it is forbidden in their old laws is actually wrong approach, because wine drinking is pleasurable. When one drinks wine, it brings pleasure to them. The talk about wine drinking is kind of a vicarious enjoyment of wine, especially since wine drinking is a forbidden pleasure. So the talking about wine drinking itself is a pleasure, because the actual drinking of wine has been prohibited. So the Athenian is trying, or Socrates, as we have already know now, which will be opened later. So he is trying to make them comfortable about talking about the wine and stuff. Perhaps the talk reminds the two interlocutors of secret and pleasurable transgressions of their own. The effort of the talk about wine is therefore similar to the effect of actual wine drinking. Why? Because when they talk about wine drinking, the old men or the interlocutors will be reminded of how when they drank wine, sometimes secretly breaking the law, they enjoyed it so much. So they would go into a state of reminiscence and they would go into a state of enjoyment. So they're not actually drinking wine, but the effect of wine drinking is taking over them, because they're going into a dreamlike state where they're remembering and reminiscing how they used to enjoy the drinking of the wine. So how pleasurable it would be. The effect of the talk about it loosens their tongues, it makes them young, it makes them bold and daring and willing to innovate, because they had broken a law by drinking wine, and now they are reminded of the pleasure the wine drinking brings to them. And this makes them very bold and daring, and that they are ready to introduce something new. So they must not actually drink wine, since this would impair their judgment. They must drink wine not in deed but in speech. So drinking wine in speech is like a metaphor that drinking wine in speech means breaking the laws. Okay, matlab, you know, to be being bold enough to do something daring and innovative, because if they actually drink wine, then that would impair their judgment. They would be in a state of like an unconsciousness, and they would not be able to make proper decisions. This means though that wine drinking educates to boldness, to courage, and not to moderation, and yet wine drinking was said to be conducive to moderation. Let us therefore consider the other partner in the conversation, the Athenian philosopher. To doubt the sacredness of the ancestral means to appeal from the ancestral to the natural. It means to transcend all human traditions, nay, the whole dimension of the merely human. It means to learn to look down on the human as something inferior or to leave the cave. But by leaving the cave, one losing sight of the city, of the whole political sphere. The philosopher is to give political guidance, he must return to the cave from the light of the sun to the world of shadows. His perception must be dimmed. His mind must undergo an obfuscation. The vicarious enjoyment of wine through a conversation about wine, which enlarges the horizon of the elaborate old citizens, limits the horizon of the philosopher. But this obfuscation, this acceptance of the political perspective, this adoption of the language of political man, this achievement of harmony between the excellence of man and the excellence of citizen, or between wisdom and law bindingness, what is, it seems, the most noble exercise of the virtue of moderation. The wine drinking educates to moderation. So, here what is happening is, um that when they are referring to the ancestral laws, now what laws are considered to be good? The god given laws, the divine laws. So somewhere or the other they are inferiorizing the humans and the ability of humans to create something proper and excellent and good. So what is happening is that when they are regarding the laws to be godly given or of divine origin, and when they are regarding that those laws are the best of laws, somewhere or the other the importance of the humans is inferiorizing, that how the humans are not capable of creating something which is good for everyone. For moderation is not a virtue of thought. Plato likens philosophy to madness, the very opposite of sobriety or moderation. Thought must be not be moderate but fearless, not to say shameless. But moderation is a virtue controlling the philosopher's speech. So Plato say that philosophy should be like madness, that it should not be moderation, it should not be very thing like that, but it should be shameless and moderate, and the philosopher should be allowed to go to any beyonds to when thinking and talking about philosophy. But then moderation is a virtue that controls the philosopher's speech, that limits the philosopher, that bounds the philosopher, that somewhere or the other controls the philosopher into going into going into haywire and crazy. We have suggested that the Athenian stranger had gone to Crete in order to civilize an uncivilized society, and that he had done this out of philanthropy. But does not philanthropy begin at home? Did he not have more pressing duties to perform at home? What kind of man is the Athenian stranger? The law begins with the word God. It is only Platonic dialogue which begins in that manner. So now, when we talk about that the Athenian has gone to Crete and Sparta to talk to make the uncivilized society into a civilized society and all of that, and this is out of philanthropy. Philanthropy is to do the common good, but then doesn't philanthropy or any good thing should start at home? So, what about the duties that the Athenian has to perform at his home? When he goes to Crete and Sparta to educate those people, he's basically leaving the duties at his hometown and then going somewhere else to educate the people. There is one and only one Platonic dialogue which ends with the word God, the Apology of Socrates, and only one that starts with the word God is Plato's Laws. In the Apology of Socrates, an old Athenian philosopher, Socrates defends himself against the charge of impiety of not believing that the gods worshipped by the city of Athens exist. What happened was in Athens, Socrates, who was the philosopher, he was at a point of time hated by people, and if you must know, Socrates was guilty by giving poison by the people himself, because he was charged with this, he was charged with the crime of not believing in the gods that the Athenians have worshipped for so long. So he was charged of, bringing impiety and, not believing in the gods and, breaking their tradition and so on. So it seems that there is a conflict between philosophy and accepting the gods of the city. So it seems that, of course, Socrates was a philosopher, one of the first philosophers. I mean, popular philosophers. So it was seemed as though that if you are into philosophy, you will not accept the gods of the city. In the laws, an old Athenian philosopher recommends a law about impiety which renders impossible the conflict between philosophy and the city, or which brings about harmony between philosophy and city. The god whose existence is to be admitted by every citizen of the city of the laws or being whose existence can be demonstrated. So, here the Athenian or Socrates is trying to say that if you are, the gods, malab, you should accept the existence of the gods only whose existence can be demonstrated, can be showed, and not only in theory be told about or said. The old Athenian philosophies of the apology of Socrates was condemned to death by the city of Athens. He was given an opportunity to escape from prison, but he refused to avail from this opportunity. His refusal was not based on an appeal to a categorical imperative demanding passive obedience without ifs and buts. His refusal was based on a deliberation and a prudential consideration of what was the right thing to do in these circumstances. One of the circumstances was Socrates' old age. So his refusal was not based on some kind of values and ideals that he cannot run away and do this and that, but it was based on very prudential consideration, a very practical consideration after a lot of thinking. And one of the reasons was Socrates' old age. Because Socrates realized that okay, he was given this opportunity to run away. What will happen if he runs away? He is very old, 70 or something, and we are forced to wonder how Socrates would have decided if he had been 30 or 40 years instead of 70. So, yes, we are forced to think of this that okay, this choice was taken by Socrates because of certain conditions in which old age was one of very important conditions. Then what would have been Socrates' choice of if he was a young person of 30 or 40 years? Another circumstance was the availability of proper place of exile. Where would Socrates go? Okay, he would run away from the prison, escape death. He was old enough, but then where he would go? Where would he flee? So, he seems to have a choice between law abiding cities nearby, where his life would be unbearable, says he would be known as a fugitive from justice, and a lawless country far away, where the prevailing lack of order would make his life miserable. So now Socrates thought that okay, if I will run away, I will go to either of the two places, either to a place where the law was strictly followed, like Crete and Sparta, but then there again he would be regarded as someone who has condemned justice, who did not follow justice, and who has run away. Or if he goes to a place where laws were not very seriously followed, which everything was left to pleasure and this and that, then again it would be unbearable for Socrates to live because he would not be able to adjust to the lawlessness of the land. You know, the disjunction is obviously incomplete. There were law abiding cities far away, for instance, in Crete, which is mentioned as a law abiding place in the very deliberation in question. So we are entitled to infer that if Socrates had fled, he would have gone to Crete. So now here comes the moment of, reveal or revelation or whatever, that the dialogue that is included in Plato's laws is not an actual dialogue taking place. It was a scenario made up by Plato that if Socrates would have run away, he would have run away to Crete. And what would have he done in Crete? That he would have tried to introduce new laws into Crete. So that is what would have happened if Socrates would have run away. The laws tells us that he would have done in Crete after his arrival. He would have brought the blessings of Athens, Athenian laws, Athenian institutions, banquets, and philosophy to Crete. So, when Aristotle speaks about Plato's laws, he takes it for granted that the chief character of the laws is Socrates. Escaping to Crete, living in Crete was the alternative to dying in Athens. But Socrates chose to die in Athens. Socrates preferred to sacrifice his life in order to preserve philosophy in Athens rather than introducing it into Crete. If the danger to the future of philosophy in Athens had been less great, he might have chosen to flee to Crete. But he decided to die in Athens itself because the chance of, The going down of philosophy was very great in Athens. So this was one of the ways Socrates saw that if he takes this path, then somewhere of the other philosophy will remain alive in Athens, and that was more necessary than introducing the Athenian laws into Crete. It did not, so his choice was a political choice of the highest order. It did not consist in the simple subsumption of his case under a simple, universal, and unalterable rule. But let us return after this long story to the beginning of Plato's laws. If the originator of the Cretan laws or any other laws is not a god, the cause of laws must be human beings, the human legislator. There is a variety of types of human legislators. The legislator has a different character in a democracy, in an oligarchy, in a monarchy. So now let's say that the Cretan and the Spartan laws were not actually of the divine origin, but they were created by the humans only. So now a human legislator means somebody who takes care of the laws, who makes laws. So a human legislator has different characters. In a democracy, the kind of laws that will be made by a human legislator would be much different than the kind of laws that will be made by the human legislator, in an oligarchy or in a monarchy. The legislature is the governing body, and the character of the governing body depends on the whole social and political order, the politia, the regime. So it's true. The kind of laws, the governing body that is there in practice will depend on the regime itself. Okay, like in a tyranny or in a despotic rule, the governing body will be much more strict and much more diligent to following the laws and strictly in this and that. In a democracy, the governing body will be very much according to the needs of the people, and its main aim will be the needs of the people and the best of the people. The cause of the laws is the regime, because of course the laws that will be made because of the regime, and the laws which will be made which will be affected by the regime a great deal. So the guiding theme of political philosophy is the regime rather than the laws. So it is not the laws that guide the political philosophy, but the regime that guides the political philosophy. In which regime the political philosophy is practiced or made or discussed about makes a lot of difference in the political philosophy. Regime becomes the guiding theme of political thought, then the derivative or questionable character of laws has been realized. There are a number of biblical terms which can be properly translated by law. There is no biblical equivalent to regime. Regime is the order, the form which gives society its character. Regime is therefore a specific manner of life. Regime is the form of life as living together, the manner of living of a society and in society. Since this manner depends decisively on the predominance of human beings of a certain type, on the manifest domination of society by human beings of a certain type. Regime means that whole which we today are in the habit of viewing primarily in a fragmentized form. Regime being simultaneously the form of life of a society, in style of life, its moral taste, form of society, form of state, form of government, spirit of law. So, regime is all of this. The kind of law, the kind of state, the kind of lifestyle, the kind of society that is going on, the character of the society, everything is the regime. Everything is affected by the regime. We may try to articulate the simple and unified thought that expresses itself in the term politia as follows. Life is activity which is directed towards some goal. Social life is an activity which is directed towards such a goal as can be pursued only by society. But in order to pursue a specific goal, which is comprehensive goal, society must be organized, ordered, constructed, constituted in a manner which is in accordance with that goal. This, however, means that the men in authority must be attuned to that goal. So, of course, the kind of lifestyle in a society, how that society is structured, very much depends on the goal of that society, and the regime or the people who are in power must be attuned to that goal. So only then will the society be ordered in that particular manner. Order does not mean a single thing. Okay, there can be different kinds of orders, but that order of the society should be in accordance to the goal. And what that goal is, matlab, the people who are in rule should be accordance to that goal. Only then that society will be structured in that particular manner which is needed. There is a variety of regimes. Each regime raises a claim, explicitly or implicitly, which extends beyond the boundaries of any given society. These claims conflict, therefore, with each other. There is a variety of conflicting regimes. Thus, regimes themselves and not our preoccupation as mere bystanders force us to wonder which of the given conflicting regimes is better and ultimately which regime is the best regime. Classical political philosophy is guided by the question of the best regime. So, yes, there are so many conflicting regimes. There's democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, republican, despotism, tyranny, so many different regimes. And these regimes are often at conflict with each other. What one tells, the other tells the opposite of it. So, classical philosophy is guided by the question of what is the best regime, which will be the best regime to, you know, to fulfill our goal. The actualization of the best regime depends on the coming together, on the coincidence of things which have a natural tendency to move away from each other, on the coincidence of philosophy and political power. Its actualization depends therefore on chance. Human nature is enslaved in so many ways that it is almost a miracle if an individual achieves the highest good. What can one expect of society? The peculiar manner of being of the best regime, namely its lacking actuality while being superior to all actual regimes, has its ultimate reason in the dual nature of man, in the fact that man is the in between being existing between the life of brutes and that of the gods. So the human nature is, of course, enslaved and so complicated that it's almost a miracle to achieve the highest good. And in reality, in practicality, there is no highest good, there is no best, because there can be not one thing that is good for everyone. It is not practically possible. So the peculiar manner of being the best regime is the you know is that the best regime should be superior to all regimes, has its ultimate reason in the dual nature of a man. In fact, that man is the in between, being existing between the life of brutes and that of the gods. So the best regime is also one of the utopian things because there is nothing best as such. The practical meaning of the notion of the best regime appears most clearly what one considers the ambiguity of the term good citizen. Aristotle suggests two entirely different definitions of the good citizen. In his more popular Constitution of Athens, he suggests that the good citizen is a man who serves his country well without any regard to the difference of regimes, who serves his country well with a fundamental indifference to the change of regimes. So now when talked about a good citizen, Aristotle tries to define good citizen in two very different, almost opposing ways. Okay, and these two definitions are very very different to each other. So in one of the works, which is the Constitution of Athens by Aristotle, he says that a good citizen is the one who serves the country no matter what regime is going on. So, regardless of the regime, who serves the country at their best is the good citizen. The good citizen, in a word, is the patriotic citizen, the man whose loyalty belongs first and last to his fatherland, not to the regime, not who is in power, who is not in power, but to the fatherland only. Whatever is best for the fatherland is his duty. In the less popular Politics, now another work by Aristotle, Politics, Aristotle says that there is not the good citizen without qualification. For what it means to be a good citizen depends entirely upon the regime. Now, Aristotle says that the good citizen depends upon the regime. A good citizen in Hitler's Germany would be a bad citizen elsewhere. So, a good citizen is the one who complies with the regime, because as example given here by Leo, that a citizen who will be good in Hitler's regime will be a bad citizen elsewhere, because he'll be talking about killing the Jews and this and that. But whereas good citizenship is relative to the regime, good man does not have such a relativity. So a good citizen is relative to the regime, that means who is in power. Following that is what the good citizen's duty is, but not a good man. A good man will be good everywhere, regardless of the circumstances, the place, the situation, anywhere. A good man will be a good man, but a good citizen will not be a good citizen in every regime. The good man is identical with the good citizen only in one case, in the case of the best regime. So, a good man will only be a good citizen only when there is the best regime is being followed, because if the best regime is being followed, then the citizen will be good in most of the places, and that is how he or she will also be a good man in those places. For only is the best regime are the good of the regime and the good of the good man identical, and that good being virtue. This amounts to saying that in his Politics, Aristotle questions the proposition that patriotism is enough. From the point of view of the patriot, the fatherland is more important than any difference of regimes. From the point of view of the patriot, he who refers any regime to the fatherland is a partisan, if not a traitor. Aristotle says, in effect, that the partisan sees deeper than the patriot, but only that one kind of partisan is superior to patriot, that is the partisan of virtue. So now, of course, they're talking about two different kinds of good citizen. One who is just loyal to the fatherland and not the regime, and another who is loyal to the regime. Okay, and that regime stands, at the topmost priority for that citizen. One can express Aristotle's thought as follows: patriotism is not enough for the same reason for which the most doting mother is happier if her child is good than if he is bad. So, patriotism is not enough because a mother, if the mother just has love for the child, he or she will not see that whether the child is good or bad. Similarly, a patriotic will just love his or her fatherland. He or she will not see that whatever is being done by the people of the fatherland is good or bad. A mother loves her child because he is her own. She loves what is her own, but she also loves the good. All human love stands under the law to be both love of one's own and love of the good, and there is necessarily a tension between one's own and the good. A tension which may lead to a break, be it only the breaking of the heart. So there is a tension. Whether you love what is good, whether you love what is your own. Okay, and this kind of conflict we see in so many movies, and this is a concept like the example given here, that there is a mother. What should the mother do? Should the mother be in love of the child, because the child is her own, no matter how the child is her own, and the mother has to love her child. But what if the child goes on to the wrong paths? Then what should the mother choose? Should the mother choose between love for the good, love of the good, or love of her own? And that leads to the breaking of heart. The relationship between one's own and the good finds its political expression in the relationship between the fatherland and the regime. So one's own is the fatherland, and what is good, love for the good, is the regime. In the language of classical metaphysics, the fatherland or the nation is the matter, whereas the regime is the form. The classics held the view that the form is higher in dignity than the matter. So according to classical thing, the fatherland is inferior to the regime, because fatherland is the matter, whereas regime is the form, and the form is higher than the matter. One may call this view idealism. The practical meaning of this idealism is that the good is of the higher dignity than one's own. So, of course, regime is the form, and if form is higher than the matter, then that means that the good is higher than one's own, being one's own. That is, the love for good should be given more importance than the love for our own. If your own is doing something wrong, then he or she should not be chosen over the good. The practical meaning of this idealism is that the Jewish equivalent of this relation might be said to be the relation between the Torah and Israel. Classical political philosophy is today exposed to two very common objections, the raising of which neither requires neither originality nor legend or intelligence nor even erudition. The objections are these: the classical political philosophy is anti-democratic and hence bad. Classical political philosophy is based on classical natural philosophy or classical cosmology, and this basis has been proven to be untrue by the success of modern natural science. Now, there are two objections that the classical political philosophy faces. First is that it is anti-democratic. Why anti-democratic? Because of course, we are saying that the classical philosophy is very much natural. Okay, it was inspired by those conditions at that time, and at that time there was no democracy. So classical political philosophy is anti-democratic and hence bad, because democracy is considered good. Second objection is that it is based on natural philosophy, classical natural philosophy, and that classical natural philosophy has already been proven untrue by modern science. So the classical political philosophy, which claimed that it is a very natural philosophy, that natural philosophy holds no power or holds no righteousness in itself, and that is being proven untrue by modern science. To speak first of the classics' attitude towards democracy, the premises the classics are good and democracy is good do not validate the conclusion, hence the classics were good Democrats. It would be silly to deny that the classics rejected democracy as inferior kind of regime. They were not blind to its advantages. The severest indictment of democracy that ever was written occurs in the eighth book of Plato's Republic. But even there, and precisely there, Plato makes this clear by coordinating his arrangement of regimes with Hesiod's arrangement of the ages of the world that democracy is, in a very important respect, equal to the best regime which corresponds to Hesiod's golden age. Since the principle of democratic freedom, all human types can develop freely in a democracy, and hence, in particular, the best human type. It is true that Socrates was killed by a democracy, but he was killed when he was 70. He was permitted to live for 70 long years. In anti democratic Sparta, he would have been exposed as an infant and left to die. So they are trying to say, they are trying to revert the objection that democracy is good, and those the Athenians also followed democracy because it was democracy because of which Socrates is allowed to live even for 70 years. Sparta was anti-democratic. Why? Because it was traditional in its approach, it followed the laws of the ancestors, and according to Sparta, Aristotle would have been recognized as an infant only and he would have been left to die. But it was the democracy which allowed him to live for those 70 years. Yet Plato did not regard this consideration as decisive, for he was concerned not only with the possibility of philosophy but likewise with a stable political order that would be congenial to moderate political courses. And such an order, he thought, depends on the predominance of old families. So, more generally, the classics rejected democracy because they thought that the aim of human life and hence of social life is not freedom but virtue. So as given the example here, they thought that the human life should not be guided by the principle of freedom. Today we value democracy because it gives the freedom to the citizen to make his own choice, and today we regard freedom as more important than virtues. But at that time, virtues or the good principle, the good values were regarded as more important to the human being. And that is why instead of democracy, they would prefer the regime, they would prefer the codes and the laws of the old people, their ancestors. Somewhere the old families more freedom has a goal is ambiguous because they thought that freedom is ambiguous. You cannot achieve total freedom, and it is a very abstract thing, a very abstract thing, because it is freedom for evil as well as for good. Because they thought that if we talk about freedom, then it is freedom for the good also and freedom for the bad also. The evil also gets the freedom. Virtue emerges normally only through education, that is to say, through the formation of character, through habituation, and this requires leisure on part of both parents and children. But virtue, on the other hand, it is developed only through education, a proper education, and it is developed only through a proper development of the character. But leisure, in its turn, requires some degree of wealth, more specifically, a kind of wealth whose acquisition or administration is compatible with leisure. Now, as regards wealth, so it happens, as Aristotle observes, that there is always a minority of well to do people and a majority of the poor. And this strange coincidence will last forever because there is a kind of natural scarcity. So, Aristotle says that there we see virtue needs education, a formation of character, and that is only possible when there is wealth. Of course, you cannot educate anybody out of no money or anything. Education today needs wealth, and that time also needed wealth. But then Aristotle also observes one thing, that in terms of wealth there is a minority of people that do very good, they are very wealthy and they have the things, but the majority are poor, they don't have money. And this will last forever. Why? Because there is a natural scarcity, because the natural resources are not present in those numbers as they should be. So always the natural resources are less, so the lesser number of people will have access to those. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. The poor will always be there. They will never end. There will always be a situation where the majority will be the poor. It is for this reason that democracy, or the rule of the majority, is government by the uneducated. So now they are trying to prove a point that the majority is the poor. the uneducated, and democracy because it gives power to the majority. So democracy is a rule by the uneducated people, by the poor people, and no one in a sense would wish to be ruled by an uneducated, by a government which is formed by the uneducated people, because they're uneducated. They don't know what is good for them. They don't have the virtues. Responsible are the virtues that come after education. This classic argument would not be stringent if men did not need education in order to acquire a firm adherence to virtue. So this is something, this is one of the criticisms of philosophy of democracy even today, that democracy is a rule of the general people and not of excellence, because the majority is general in its approach. The excellent, or the those are very few. It is no accident that it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau who taught that all knowledge which men need in order to live virtuously is supplied by conscience, the preserve of the simple souls rather than of other men. Man is sufficiently equipped by nature for the good life. Man is by nature good. So, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there is no need to teach virtue. Okay, teach virtue separately. All the virtues or the good habits which are needed are already consciously present in the man by conscience. It is naturally supplied to them, and there is no need for other people to teach them these virtues. There's no need to teach them these virtues separately. But the same Rishi was compelled to develop a scheme of education which very few people could financially afford. So, at one place, Jean-Jacques Rousseau says there is no need to teach the virtue, it is already there present. But on the other hand, it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau only who developed a kind of education which very few people could afford. On the whole, this view has prevailed that democracy must become ruled by the educated, and this goal will be achieved by universal education. But universal education presupposes that economy of scarcity has given way to an economy of plenty, and the economy of plenty presupposes the emancipation of technology from moral and political control. So they rejected democracy because of this reason. You see the connection, that the majority are the poor because there is a natural scarcity. Naturally, so many resources are not available, so majority will always be poor, and democracy is ruled by majority. So democracy, and if they are poor, they are not educated. So democracy is ruled by the educated, and nobody wants a government by the uneducated. So democracy is the rule by uneducated. The essential difference between our view and the classical view consists then not in a difference regarding moral principle, not in a different understanding of justice. We too, even the communists with whom we coexist, think that it is just to give the equal things to equal people and unequal things to people of unequal merit. The difference between the classics and us with regard to democracy consists exclusively in a different estimate of the virtues of technology. But we are not entitled to say that the classical view has been refuted. Their implicit prophecy that the emancipation of technology of the arts from moral and political control could lead to disaster or to dehumanization of man has not yet been refuted. Nor can we say that democracy has found a solution to the problem of education. So we cannot even say that, because even today, democracy is the rule by the majority, and the majority is general, it's not highly qualified. In the first place, what is today called education very frequently does not mean education proper, that is the formation of character, but rather instruction and training. Today, education does not really form, is the formation of character. It's true. Today, education has become very much theoretical, it's just instruction and training. Secondly, to the extent to which the formation of character is indeed intended, there exists a very dangerous tendency to identify the good man with the good sport, the cooperative fellow, the regular guy. That is, there is an overemphasis on a certain part of social virtue and a corresponding neglect of those virtues which mature if they do not flourish in privacy, not to say in solitude. By educating people to cooperate with each other in a friendly spirit, one does not yet educate non-conformists, people who are prepared to stand alone, to fight alone, rugged individualists. Democracy has not yet found a defense against the creeping conformism and the ever increasing invasion of privacy which it fosters. Beings who look down on us from a star might find that the difference between democracy and communism is not quite as great as it appears to be when one considers exclusively the doubtless very important question of civil and political liberties, although only people of exceptional levity or responsibility say that the difference between communism and democracy is negligible in the last analysis. So, what yes, it happens is that it sometimes ignores those virtues that develop in privacy. So there's so much it so much focuses on the social virtues that it forgets or it neglects the virtues that should also develop in privacy when you're alone. Now, to the extent to which democracy is aware of these dangers, to the same extent it sees itself compelled to think of elevating its level and its possibilities by a return to the classic notion of education. A kind of education which can never be thought of a mass education, but only as a higher and highest education of those who are by nature fit for it. It would be an understatement to call it royal education. So, not royal education, but education only for those who are actually fit for that kind of education. Yet, granted that there are no valid or moral political obligation to classical political philosophy, is that political philosophy not bound up with an antiquated cosmology? Does not the very question of the nature of man point to the question of the nature of the whole, and therewith to one or the other specific cosmology? So now, when classical political philosophy is found to be called to be very, classical natural philosophy or classical political, classical cosmology, so, isn't it that the man's nature also points out to the cosmology, a specific cosmology? Whether the significance of modern natural science may be, it cannot affect our understanding of what is human in man. To understand man is the light of the in the light of the whole means for modern natural science to understand man in the light of subhuman, but in the light as man in wholly unintelligible. Classical philosophy viewed man in a different light. It was originated by Socrates, and Socrates was so far from being committed to a specific cosmology that his knowledge was knowledge of ignorance. Knowledge of ignorance is not ignorance, it is knowledge of the elusive character of the truth of the whole. So, today when we talk about the modern science, okay, no matter what modern science talks about, but it somewhere fails to see the human in man, which the classical natural philosophy looks at. And Socrates was aware of the knowledge of ignorance. Now, knowledge of ignorance doesn't mean to ignore, but the knowledge of ignorance means that the truth has a hidden character in it. The truth has a character. The truth has the character that it hides itself. It doesn't reveal itself. The elusive character of the truth. So Socrates was aware of this knowledge of ignorance. He had the knowledge of this ignorance, that the how the truth does not reveal itself. It is us who have to find for it. Look for it. Socrates then viewed man in the light of the mysterious character of the whole. He held, therefore, that we are more familiar with the situation of man as man than with the ultimate causes of that situation. We may also say he viewed man in the light of the unchangeable ideas, that is, of the fundamental and permanent problems. For to articulate the situation of man means to articulate man's openness for the whole. This understanding of the situation of man, which includes then the quest for cosmology rather than a solution to the cosmological problem, has the foundation of classical political philosophy. So, this understanding of the situation of man, which includes then the quest for cosmology rather than a solution to cosmological problem, because it's not really, because we first have to look for the cosmology, because the truth has an elusive character. The truth has a character to hide itself, not to reveal itself. So that is the foundation of classical political philosophy. To articulate the problem of cosmology means to answer the question of what philosophy is or what a philosopher is. Political Plato refrained from entrusting the thematic discussion of this question to Socrates. He entrusted it to a stranger from Elia, but even that stranger from Elia did not discuss explicitly what a philosopher is. He discussed explicitly two kinds of men which are easily mistaken for the philosopher, the sophist and the statesman. So we have already learnt about the sophist. If you have watched my previous videos in the previous semesters, we have discussed about who the sophist is. So there are two kinds of mistaken identities of the philosopher, the sophist and the statesman. Both of them are mistaken to be philosopher, but they are not philosopher. Sophistry in its highest level, and statesmanship. One will understand what philosophy is. Philosophy strives for knowledge of the whole, which we have already discussed in the first part of this article itself. The whole is the totality of parts. The whole eludes us, but we know parts. So we know the parts of it, but we don't really know the whole of it until now. And the whole has the character to elude itself, to hide itself. We possess partial knowledge of the parts. Even of the parts, we don't know the truth about the whole of the parts. We only know some things about the parts. The knowledge which we possess is characterized by a fundamental dualism which has never been overcome. At one pole, we find knowledge of homogeneity, above all in arithmetic, but also in the other branches of mathematics and derivatively in all productive arts or crafts. At the opposite pole, we find knowledge of heterogeneity, and in particular of heterogeneous ends. The highest form of this kind of knowledge is the arts of the statesman and of the educator. So, one place is the knowledge of homogeneity. Okay, like arts, crafts, everything, and the other is heterogeneity, that is of the statesman, the educator. The latter kind of knowledge is superior to the former for this region. The knowledge of the statesman, the knowledge of the educator is superior than the knowledge of the productive arts or crafts. As knowledge of the ends of human life, it is knowledge of what makes human life more complete or whole. It is therefore knowledge of a whole. Knowledge of the ends of man implies knowledge of the human soul, and the human soul is the only part of the whole which is open to the whole and therefore more akin to the whole than anything else. So the human soul and the knowledge of the human soul which lead us closer to the knowledge of the whole, because it is the knowledge of the human soul and the human soul which which is the closest to the truth about the whole. This knowledge, the political art in the highest sense, is not knowledge of the whole. It seems that knowledge of the whole would have to combine somehow political knowledge in the highest sense with knowledge of homogeneity, and this combination is not at our disposal. Men are therefore constantly tempted to force the issue by imposing unity on the phenomena by absolutizing either knowledge of homogeneity or knowledge of ends. Men are constantly attracted and deluded by two opposite charms: the charm of competence, which is engendered by mathematics and everything akin to mathematics, and the charm of humble awe, which is engendered by meditation and the human soul and its experiences. So these are two very different things, as we can understand. The charm of competence, the charm of humble awe. At one place we have mathematics, which is very concrete, which is based on very facts and evidences, doesn't talk about something which is not really concrete. But then on the other hand is the human soul, its experiences, which has nothing concrete in it, which is very subjective in nature, whereas mathematics, which is so much objective in nature. Philosophy is characterized by the gentle, if firm, refusal to succumb to either charm. So philosophy is the moderation of both of these. It is a mating of courage and moderation. It will not succumb to either of these. It will have both of them. Its highness or nobility, it could appear as Sisyphean or ugly when one contrasts its achievement with its goal. Yet it is necessarily accompanied, sustained, and elevated by eros. It is graced by nature's grace. So that is what philosophy is. It is a combination of the courage as well as moderation, of extreme and moderation, both of them. It is not even moderate, it is not even extreme, but it is extreme as well as moderate. And that is what philosophy is.